Thank you, Lisa, very much for inviting me. It's lovely to come to Birmingham. It's close, but still feels like I got away. And my children are very much expecting me back at 4:30. My work is on social human rights, and soon will be on social goods and social virtues. I'm finishing up a book project on social human rights, in which I argue that we have a human right against social deprivation. And by that, I do not mean economic welfare deprivation, poverty, and so on. I mean interpersonal social deprivation. So we have a right not to be denied minimally adequate access to decent human contact. And I flesh out a story about that. I won't speak specifically to that today. I'm interested in looking at children in the context of epistemic injustice and loneliness. A few of my other thoughts will probably dribble in the back, but I'm going to focus on children. And this is a topic that I'm beginning to explore with some psychologists and sociologists. We are building up a network to look at childhood and adolescent loneliness, and are trying to find a funder to do a large project, and a disciplinary project on that, because so much of the academic discussion and the public debate is about older adults. But it's already highlighted that children and older adolescents experience loneliness as often, if not more often, than older adults do. So it's an important topic that needs to be explored more. So I'll just start with saying a word about my title. So Not Seen and Not Heard, this is a play on the old adage, children should be seen and not heard. And my first thought is that a child who's feeling lonely, deeply lonely, this is perhaps their experience, that they feel both unseen and unheard. And that many children, in particular settings, perhaps specifically clinical encounters, can feel unseen and unheard. Unseen except as an object of treatment, and unheard when it comes to their own self-reporting about their health, or their experiences in a medical context, or their opinion on their treatment and care. When thinking about this topic, a story that came to mind is Ian McEwan's The Children Act. And I'll try not to spoil all of it. I'll spoil just a little bit of it, I'm afraid. In this novel, there's a 17-year-old boy, Adam, who has leukemia, and he needs a life-saving blood transfusion. But he and his family are members of Jehovah's Witnesses. And the protagonist, Judge Fiona May, who's a family court, high court judge, she has to decide whether or not to order the transfusion. And she actually visits him in the hospital, and she listens to him read his poetry to her. They sing together, and she does go away and ultimately decides to order the transfusion. And McEwan describes quite graphically the effect that this treatment has on Adam. So when he's provided the transfusion in hospital, he vomits across the hospital bed. He feels violated by this treatment. And McEwan then describes that Adam's parents come into the hospital room afterward in joyful tears because they had stayed true to their beliefs. They'd been pressed by elders of their community to stay true to their beliefs, which they had done, but they still got to keep their son. And Adam is repulsed by their joy and breaks off from his family and feels very, very disoriented, very alienated. He's lost a secure sense of meaning. And so he actually seeks out Judge May for her to give him a reorientation. And then the climax of the story follows. So I won't, I've given you a lot, but there's still stuff to come, so it's still well worth reading. But I think the story is very interesting because Adam's he's 17, so he sort of falls in that grey area of should he be seen as fully competent? But even much younger children who aren't 16, who are very young, can still have an opinion about their about their treatment, you can still have an interest in being told what's happened to them or what's about to happen to them. And I want to explore that a bit in relation to epistemic injustice. So the second reason for my title is sort of that. How should children be viewed in terms of their mental health, their medical health in general? What weight should we give to their self-reporting? And particularly with respect to loneliness, what weight should we give to a child's self-reporting that they don't feel lonely or that they do feel lonely? Because one thing you might ask is, can one feel lonely or be lonely and be unaware that one is lonely? If one lacks the concept to describe it, or if one can't fully understand or process a certain concept, can one nonetheless be having an experience? Or do you have to be conscious of your, because loneliness, if you understand in terms of a self-perception, do you have to be conscious that you're lonely in order to actually be lonely? And also, what kind of emotional attitude is required for someone to be lonely? A colleague of mine, Tim Thornton, has highlighted this question to me, that if you don't feel wistful about your sense of inadequacy, so you desire that your relationships were other than you believe they are, but you don't feel a certain wistfulness about that inadequacy, are you still lonely? And I think it's a question that's particularly relevant to children, is of what kinds of, how they relate to their emotions, how they relate to their experiences may be different from what we would assume adults would do. And then the third reason for the title Not Seen and Not Heard is just to highlight that loneliness in children is a comparatively neglected phenomenon, that there are studies in psychology. Paola Quartal, who's now at the University of Manchester, is a colleague of mine, I'm collaborating with her. She is the UK's leading expert on childhood loneliness, but she has highlighted that there are far fewer studies of children than of older adults. And in philosophy, there's a burgeoning literature in philosophy of childhood, and some of that literature focuses on topics related to loneliness. So Matthew Liao has written a book on the right to be loved. He argues that children have, he says, a human right. There's a human right during childhood to be loved. And so that sort of bears on the question of loneliness when children are left exposed to certain conditions that make it highly likely that they will feel lonely. But there isn't a direct literature on loneliness in childhood from a philosophical perspective. And so I'm hoping, perhaps when my children grow up, to get to that and to write some things in that area. Okay, so what particular epistemic issues are posed by loneliness, particularly loneliness experienced by children? Kathy's very nicely summarized the different types of epistemic injustice. There is the very simple, basic one of denying a person information or knowledge, doing that unjustly. And in the case of children, that's very interesting. When are we unjustly denying a child knowledge, and when are we actually protecting a child by not giving them certain kinds of knowledge? Just very trivially, in reception class, children are given a nasal spray vaccine. I, as a parent, was told, your child may have a high temperature afterward. They may feel a bit queasy. They might have a runny nose. I would be surprised if my child had been told those things, and it was sort of maybe left to my discretion to talk to him about those things. And for my sins, I didn't really get into why his nose was running and so on. But we tend not to talk to children very much about what's happening to them. And certainly if they have to be isolated when they are unwell and feel lonely as a result of that, we sort of see it as a necessary evil, an unfortunate side effect of treating them and making them well so they can rejoin the social group. But again, don't really dwell on or process for them that they may be feeling lonely. Okay. When we have a concept in circulation, then we're able to assemble and to mobilize, to make sense of it to ourselves and to others, to recognize it in ourselves, recognize it in others. And here, this, in terms of thinking of sort of a potential future project, collaborative project, I'd be very interested to think through concepts that we don't have, concepts that are not well specified, that particularly pertain to children's experiences. So what kinds of harmful or difficult experiences do children have which we haven't given them a language, or ourselves a language to describe? Children as a group, they're less linguistically able, so less able to articulate to others a certain kind of experience. They're less communicatively adroit, they're comparatively disempowered, and as Kathy highlighted, epistemic injustice, these are about power dynamics, and sort of who has the power of definition, the power to carve up the world according to their concepts. And I was talking to some colleagues yesterday about this and asked them if they could give me some examples of experiences that they thought children have for which we don't have a good conceptual framework. And of course, quite a big task. Please, on the spot, provide me with a concept that doesn't yet exist. But they rose to the challenge. So one colleague, David Jenkins, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Warwick working on sociability, he told the story about going to school on the first day of school, and the friends that he agreed to meet up with had somehow disappeared. And he said he felt a sense of agoraphobia, and also that sort of child sense that you're being watched, that people who are in friendship groups are observing you in your aloneness. There isn't that sense that yes, he's describing something, but there isn't a good concept for this sense of exposure and vulnerability, first day school vulnerability. Another colleague, David Woods, talked about the fact that children can identify, for example, with in Alice in Wonderland, that shows how a children might see our world in terms of its very strange rules. These everyone knows the norms except you. You're sort of on the precipice of understanding, and then there's going to be sort of this snowball of understanding, the cumulative growth of understanding, where things become more accessible to you and less threatening, less alienating when you're able to suddenly make sense of the world. And then a third colleague, Christoph Horrell, highlighted the fact that sometimes as a child you can experience the simple epistemic injustice, or perhaps not quite an injustice, an epistemic bad, of not being provided a concept that would be useful. So he went through school not knowing of the concept of bullying, not knowing of something that he himself probably experienced or that he himself was capable of doing to other people. And he also highlighted that sometimes we press concepts on children. So the concept of stranger, we press onto children, perhaps too early. And you have to be wary of strangers, stranger danger. Don't talk to strangers, or certainly if you're not with mom or dad. And in pressing concepts on children, we can sometimes stifle natural good inclinations to be open-hearted, to be neighborly, to be generous and kind, and so on, by highlighting their reasons to be fearful of some people. Okay, so in question and answer, if you've got other examples of concepts we haven't yet put terms to that would capture experiences that children have, particularly related to loneliness, I'd be very interested to hear them. Okay. I don't know if I've got anything more I want to say related to that. Just to highlight that there is this question of when a concept is in circulation, is it a just thing, is it a good thing to provide it to a child or not to provide it to a child? One worry about providing a child with a concept, certainly in a medical context, might be that they come to see themselves through the lens of that concept. So if a child is told that they have autism, or indeed if a child is told that they are lonely or feel lonely, could that sort of overshape their sense of who they are? And I don't think it's only children who can come to see themselves sort of too narrowly through the lens of a certain concept. Related to that, if a child is having to endure a certain type of experience, is it better or worse for them to understand what it is that they're enduring? And then very briefly on testimonial injustice, the idea that we can wrong people as knowers of their own minds, knowers of their own well-being. And again, so returning to the question that I raised at the outset of what weight should we put on a child's impression of her experience, her wishes about her care, her sense of her own mental well-being. When is it an injustice to ignore her? When is it an injustice to listen to her? So I won't answer these questions, I'm afraid. This presentation is question heavy and answer light, which is a philosopher's job. So, but does Fiona May wrong Adam as a knower of his own mind and faith when she orders the transfusion? Another case, the youngest birth mother in the UK, she was 12 when she gave birth. When she was 11, she was raped by her brother and she became pregnant. And her view was that she couldn't tolerate an abortion. The youngest birth mother in the world was 5. It's stunning that someone could have to live that experience at 5. And yet, I wonder what attitude we would take to a child, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, even 12, saying, I don't want to have an abortion. Would it be an injustice to disregard that, or would it be an injustice actually to heed it? So I'll just leave that meaty question on the table. With respect to loneliness, one question which a colleague of mine, Anke Goyce, has raised is, if we could give a child a drug to reduce their experience of loneliness, their feelings of loneliness, would that be permissible? Is loneliness sort of a window into a certain kind of understanding that you would rob a child of if you reduced it? Or is loneliness sort of wholly corrosive and you actually would be cultivating a child's sense of social confidence if you did reduce their feelings of it? And does it matter what the child reports? If they report feeling lonely, would it be permissible to give them such a drug? If they don't report feeling lonely, but other indicators suggest they are lonely, would it be permissible to give it to them? And just to finish on one final question is, how do we avoid understanding children's experiences through our preconceptions about them, through our stereotyping, our sense of what they're able to communicate and what they're able to understand? And there are some studies that indicate that researchers and practitioners have to spend a lot of time with a child in order to overcome a preconceived idea about that child's abilities. So for example, spending time with a child who doesn't speak, if that child has a certain disability, the researcher might assume they cannot speak or they cannot speak well, and then find out only after a lot of time when the child's built up some trust that actually the child can speak and can articulate a sense of their own well-being. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of questions on the table. A very unsatisfying conclusion, but I'll leave it there.